Hello and welcome back to Clarkenomics. In this video, we're going to begin our experience with shifting supply and demand curves. But before things get too crazy, we're going to start off with single shifts. What that means is we're going to be either shifting the demand curve or the supply curve. Now, before we get into this, to recap from a previous video, there are some big reminders that you have to think about when we're dealing with shifting supply and demand. So the first thing is the shifters that we've talked about for demand and the shifters for supply are the only things that actually shift these curves, right? So there are 6 demand shifters and there are 6 different supply shifters. Prices changing don't cause curves to shift, and even more importantly to remember, a shift in one curve does not cause a shift in the other. That's going to be especially important in this video because what we're going to do is we're going to just shift one of the 2 curves, like just the demand curve or just the supply curve. And we're going to say that that curve shifting doesn't change anything else. So just remember, just because you're shifting one curve does not mean you're shifting the other. And then the final reminder is ERTL, increase right, decrease left. If you just remember that and ERTL the turtle lounging around down there, you will never get confused. So we're going to go through 4 different scenarios here, 2 of which will involve shifts in demand, 2 of which will involve shifts in supply. One thing that I recommend that students do a lot when it comes to this stuff is draw things out on their own. You know, it's easy to sit here and watch the video of me doing it, but then when you have to actually draw these things happening yourself, it can be kind of tough to transfer those skills. So as you're watching this video, I highly recommend that you just keep a piece of paper or a notebook handy to record some of these things and what they look like and just practice drawing. It's going to be very, very useful for you down the road. So when we're drawing all this stuff out, we want to start with our axes, our X and our Y. And one thing that's easy to overlook when we start shifting a whole bunch of stuff around are the labels for the axes. So let's remember, on the Y-axis, we always put price, which we can abbreviate as a capital letter P. And on the X-axis, we're not doing quantity demanded or quantity supplied, we're just putting quantity, which we can abbreviate here as Q, both uppercase. So always start off by making sure you've labeled both of your axes fully. From there, we can add our first curve. This is going to be a downward sloping one we're going to call demand. Now we know we're going to be showing a demand increase, so I'm just right away going to label this D1 because we know that there's going to be a D2 coming our way. One thing that I do in these videos is I keep demand a separate color from supply. So like for instance, this demand curve is blue and the supply curve is red. If you'd like to do that in your notes, that can be a handy way for now, at least to keep track of which one's which. But don't use colors as a substitute for labels. So we've got our upward sloping supply curve labeled S. On the test that I give to my students at least, I don't do them in color, so both curves would be in black and white, but at least for learning them and where things go, it's helpful sometimes to use different colors. So we've got supply and demand. From that, we can get our market equilibrium price, which initially is going to be there at P subscript E1. And our market equilibrium quantity, which is on the X-axis, of course, because that's our quantity axis, and that's going to be our first equilibrium quantity. And as this demand shift happens, both of those things are going to change. So let's get into our demand shift here. Let's imagine that we have demand increasing. Why? Not because of a change in price or anything like that, right? But because of one of those 7 demand shifters, so maybe taste or preferences, right? Let's say that people like the product more, so we're going to see an increase in demand, which is a shift to the right. So I've included these little yellow arrows that say increase right inside of them just to remind you that an increase in demand is a shift to the right. So there's D2. It now crosses the supply curve at a higher point. So what does that mean is going to happen? Well, the first thing is we're going to find a new market equilibrium price, and we can call it PE2. And the important thing here is that that is a higher market equilibrium price than we had before. In other words, demand shifting to the right increased the market equilibrium price from PE1 up to PE2. With that said, what's going to happen to the equilibrium quantity as a result of this demand shift? Well, we have a new quantity that is to the right of our old quantity, and so that is going to be an increase in the equilibrium quantity. So when a demand shift happens, and again, we're not shifting the supply curve at all, this demand curve shift does not cause a shift in supply, just a movement upwards along the supply curve. The increase in price is going to increase, the increase in demand is going to increase the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. If we were to look at the opposite situation now, decrease in demand, that's a decrease to the left, D2 is to the left of D1, we're going to have a market equilibrium price that is lower than what it was before, and a market equilibrium quantity that is lower than it was before. So this is just the reverse of scenario 1. If demand decreases, price and quantity both decrease. One thing that you might want to note for yourself about demand shifts happening is when demand changes, price and quantity move in the same direction as each other, right? So when demand decreases, price and quantity both decrease. When demand increase, price and quantity both increased. So bear that in mind. So we're done shifting demand for now. Here's what a supply shift looks like. So we're going to start off with our same axes as before, price on the y, quantity on the x. There's our demand curve, there's our supply curve. And again, as I'm going through these, it would be a good idea for you to draw them out as well, so you can get comfortable shifting curves around and finding your new equilibria, stuff like that. So we've got S1 as our label for the supply curve because we know that we're going to be showing an increase in supply. Now again, this is where students get themselves into a lot of trouble. With supply curves, you still have ERDL, increase right, decrease left. For instance, this is an increase in supply, right? Just because it looks like it's quote-unquote below the original supply curve doesn't mean it's a decrease. Since the supply curve is shifting to the right and these are parallel lines, that is an increase in the supply. So you see the little arrows, the yellow, that say increase right. So the question is, what is that going to do for our market equilibrium price and our market equilibrium quantity? Well, all you have to do is use the same rule that we did originally. X marks the spot. So where the new supply curve intersects our demand curve, we're going to find our new market equilibrium price, which is now lower than it was before, and we're going to have a new market equilibrium quantity right there, which is higher than it was before. So when supply shifts, you're going to see price and quantity move in opposite directions, right? When the supply increases, the price decreases, but the equilibrium quantity increases. So let's look at the reverse situation. So there's our initial equilibrium. There's demand curve and there's S1 where they cross. We've got our initial equilibrium. And then supply shifts to the left, right? So that's a shift to the left. That's a decrease in supply. Our new market equilibrium price is going to be there at PE2, and that's going to be an increase in the market equilibrium price. And our new market equilibrium quantity is going to be lower than it was before, so that is a decrease in quantity. So once again, when it's a demand shift, price and quantity change in the same direction. When it's a supply shift, they change in opposite directions. So these are the 4 scenarios where just one of these 2 curves is shifting, and you're looking at the effects of that shift on the market equilibrium price and the market equilibrium quantity. We can sum it up in a table like this one, right? So we see what the shift is, we see the effect on the equilibrium price relative to what it originally was, and we see the effect on the equilibrium quantity relative to what it originally was. So if, sorry about that, demand increases, price and quantity are going to increase. If demand decreases, price and quantity are going to decrease. In other words, these 2 move in the same direction. If supply increases, one goes down, one goes up. If supply decreases, one goes up, one goes down. So if you want to copy this table into your notes as well for reference, it can be a good way to remember what happens. But when in doubt, draw it out. So hopefully that helps with single shifts. Thank you for watching.